program is being recorded and will be made available on the Detroit Public Library YouTube channel and through Wayne State University's website. I am Jennifer Dye, a librarian at Detroit Public Library. DPL has offered astronomy programs for the last several years. When things fell apart in spring 2020, programs were put on hiatus. We finally launched astronomy programs on Zoom early last year about this time. We feel that these have worked well. Over the last several months, we have worked with Megan McCullen, director of the Wayne State University Planetarium, on programs presented by Wayne State faculty and alumni. We will continue our past practice of presentations by members of local astronomy clubs, but look forward to working more with Megan and the planetarium. Next month's program will be about astrophotography for the amateur. I'd like to ask Megan McCullen to speak briefly before I introduce tonight's speaker.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I see we've got some Wayne State alums in the chat already, so that's great.
Yes.
Glad to see them here. I will post links to the planetarium's websites as well as to our Alumni Association's YouTube channel. We've also been doing some lectures in conjunction with the Alumni Association, which they've been posting on YouTube, which include a lot of visits to various places around the world related to astronomy and physics. So those are a lot of fun to watch as well. And so I'll post those links. And we don't have any upcoming events right at the moment. We're sort of in a lull, and then we're going to restock, resupply, and start over. So stay tuned for announcements and check our website. Thanks, Jen.
Hey, thank you. I'm having a problem with transferring the bio that I have for Dr. Christensen from when he gave a presentation for our James Webb Space Telescope series. He talked about the technology of the telescope. Dr. Christensen is going to tell us about his chases around the world to see total solar eclipses. Mark?
Okay. Let's see, there we go. So how's that?
It looks great.
Can everybody see the title slide? Okay, let's begin. There's really two themes in this. One is the eclipses themselves, and in the other theme being, of course, it's a darn good excuse to go see the world, which is nice to have as a backup in case you don't have perfect weather, which sometimes happens with these things. So without any further ado, let us begin. Oh, yes, I'd like to say it's always a pleasure as a Wayne State alumni myself, both from math and physics, to speak to the Wayne State community and to the Detroit Public Library, where I spent many hours in the library using it as my study hall because I could sneak off and read Sky and Telescope and astronomical journals and other things when I got tired of doing calculus problems or studying Greek history. So anyway, 6 eclipses pretty much around the world, not quite all the way, but most of the way. In case people aren't aware, there's of course 2 species of eclipses we see. There's the lunar eclipses and the solar eclipses. Lunar eclipses are much more common. In fact, there's 2 coming up this year, which I'll talk about at the end of the session, both of which will be visible from the Detroit area and from Chicagoland where I live. Lunar eclipses last much longer because of simple geometry. The Earth is much bigger than the moon, and so it casts a much larger shadow. So they're more frequent and they last much longer. The darkest phase, the so-called umbral phase or total phase of a lunar eclipse, for example, will typically last an hour, if not longer. Solar eclipses are much rarer and require much more travel to go see. And that's for the simple reason that the moon is so much smaller than the Earth. And so it casts a shadow that's only a few tens of miles wide for totality. We're indeed fortunate to be living now, because if you wait a couple 100 million years or so, the moon will continue to move outward as the angular momentum of the moon is transferred through the tides. The moon will continue to move outward and we will no longer see total eclipses. But that's not a problem in our lifetime, so it's somewhat academic. You might wonder, why don't we see total eclipses every new moon and full moon, total eclipses of the sun at the new moon and total eclipses of the moon at full moon? The simple reason is that the plane of the moon's orbit is tipped 5.2 degrees approximately to the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun, or the so-called ecliptic. This drawing is not drawn to scale because the moon is in fact many, many times further out, which means that at the extreme case, when it's up at the highest point of its orbit, highest to the north, the shadow cone is actually way up here. So there's most of the time, the shadow cone will not touch the surface of the Earth. And likewise, there is not a total eclipse of the moon every full moon for the same reason, because the two orbits are tipped. So it's only when the so-called ascending node or the descending node, which is where the two orbits intersect, it's only when those two places intersect and the moon happens to be there that you get these eclipses. There's a lot more room for error in the case of eclipses of the moon, simply because the shadow cone is so much bigger. And this is what happens when the nodes align perfectly, and it happens to be new moon and full moon when that happens. The shadow cone of the moon, if it's not too far away, which can happen, will actually touch the surface of the Earth, and we'll see a total eclipse of the sun. There are different types of eclipses you may hear mentioned. There's partial, which means nowhere on Earth does that tip of that cone actually intersect the surface. There's annular eclipses, which happen when the moon is too far away, because the orbit of the moon is not a circle, it's an ellipse. And then there are total eclipses, when the moon is close enough that its shadow is big enough that it totally covers the surface of the sun, or the so-called photosphere. The history of American eclipses goes back to around 1878, when there was a great eclipse in the West. This was a descending node eclipse. This moon was traveling through the equatorial plane, through the plane of the ecliptic, traveling from the north. So the path of totality progressed this way. And of course, just like today, the best chances for weather were out here, particularly in July. And the reason they made great journeys at that time is because this was the only way to see anything of the sun other than the photosphere. The so-called photosphere, or effectively the surface of the sun, is so intensely bright that you can't see anything else unless you have an eclipse, or you have a satellite in space, which of course they didn't have. So astronomers made great and difficult journeys. When Thomas Edison went from New Jersey to Rawlins, Wyoming for this eclipse, for example, he took like 3 days, 4 days by train through some pretty rough territory. And of course, the reason they would make these is because that's the only time they could measure and observe the corona. And it was also the only time it was dark enough that you could look for intermercurial, which means inside the orbit of Mercury, intermercurial planets, which there was a great fad to do back at that time. This is a photograph of the crew at the Draper party, as in Draper Labs, eclipse party at Rawlins, Wyoming. Thomas Edison is here. He was trying to measure the temperature of the corona using an infrared sensitive device he had just invented. The story goes is that he only got about 2 seconds of work done because he was working in what used to be a chicken coop, and since it got dark, the chickens came back. There's many notable persons in here. The other one is, of course, James C. Watson of University of Michigan, who was a prolific asteroid hunter and who firmly believed that he could and did see an intermercurial planet. Turned out he was wrong, but you can't be right all the time. A little bit of the terminology. There is the surface of the sun that we normally see, if we put filters on so we don't blind ourselves, is called the photosphere. What would be the atmosphere on the Earth is this thin layer of gases called the chromosphere, and then above that is the corona that extends out millions of miles. So my own personal history with eclipse observing was started in 1970. There were some earlier than that, but I didn't see them. The first one was March 7th in Kingston, North Carolina. The next one was 2 years later in the Bay Peninsula of Canada. Then in 1973, one of the first major eclipse tourism events, a trip to Dakar, Senegal, with the Cunard line, the Cunard White Star liner, Canberra, which was the flagship or the standard bearer at the time. Then for 33 years, having seen 2 out of 3 eclipses, and I'll tell you which ones successfully, I was rather busy with finishing my degrees at Wayne and having a job and being married and doing other things. When I left Northrop, for example, I had like 16 weeks of vacation booked because I just wasn't taking vacations. But things changed. And in 2006, a wonderful opportunity came up, another cruise, this time in the Mediterranean. And it was to Tobruk, Libya, of all places. And I'll talk about that, with the Mediterranean Shipping Company. You may see MSC containers on trucks driving around I-94 in Detroit and on I-75. 2009, another great chance to go do some tourism and to see an eclipse was a tour that the Adler Planetarium arranged in Angie, China. And then in August 21st, 2017, Little Dixie Lake near Columbia, Missouri, which had the advantage that I could actually drive to it so I could carry more equipment. This is the path of the 1970 eclipse, observed in Kingston, North Carolina. Totality there lasted 2 minutes, 54 seconds. And it was an ascending node eclipse, which means that the moon was going up from below the ecliptic and passing above the ecliptic. And it skirted right along the East Coast. In fact, if you wanted to be fashionable, you could observe it from Virginia Beach. This is a close-up view of the path of totality. Right dead center is where you get the longest. If you go a little bit off, it's not so bad. If you get out here, you don't see totality at all. So the people in Raleigh had to drive in like we did. Now, the only tourism done here was to stop in Washington, D.C. on the way, because there were 3 of us in my friend Gary Ross's, I think it was a Mercury at the time, it might have been a Ford. And we just drove nonstop, the 3 of us. We just kept driving and taking turns driving nonstop. First time I ever encountered the thing I despise most in this world, a toll road in Pennsylvania. But we stopped in Washington and got some pictures of the city. And then progressed onward down to the Carolinas. And now you know why they say God was a Tar Heel, because he made the sky Carolina blue, and it was blue for us. And we couldn't resist taking a picture of this sign when we stopped. This was in the good old days of land yachts, 1970. Mileage, what's that? And we found an agreeable farmer who had a pea field and was willing to let us set up. And here's my friends Raymond Rea, who's in Canada right now, and Gary Ross. Raymond was trying to observe with a 10-inch reflector propped up on a chair. I never did catch just how successful he was. Gary and myself were just using telephoto lenses on camera tripods. Note this tripod here and the lens. That's a 400 millimeter stock telephoto. And the tripod you will see again and again and again. This was taken with a wide angle telephoto, a 135, I believe. This is film, of course, remember. And then through my 400 millimeter lens, the eclipse. So it was a very nice eclipse. Notice that the rays are fairly uniform. The coronal streamers are almost all, it's pretty uniform around the whole circumference of the sun, and they're almost straight out. And that's because it was near totality. I mean, near the time of maximum solar activity. And it's a regular property of the sun that when the solar activity is high, the solar wind is more intense and it's more uniform. It's not just over a few localized spots, it's across the entire sun. So it blows out the streamers almost radially. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Sunspot Cycle, this is the cycle of the year 1900 through 2017 at the time. We've been in a protracted minimum. We're just now starting to climb out of it in 2022. 1970, when this eclipse occurred, was near a time of a sunspot maximum. My next 2 eclipses were down here, so the coronas weren't as uniformly bright. And then the eclipse in 2006 was also near a minimum, as were the others. 2017 was also near a minimum. So I really do need to plan my life better and have some eclipses that involve some travel and occur near a maximum. although the first one checked that box. This is a stock photo out of a university textbook. This is what you would see at a maximum eclipse, streamers everywhere. When the sunspot activity is lower, when the solar activity is lower, you get more partial streamers. So the next eclipse was to the Bay Peninsula. And this was basically a camping trip with my friend Gary and myself. Two of us drove his R16. Nowadays, they might call it an SUV. At the time, it was called a hatchback. Front wheel drive, which for 1972 was quite something. And we had a nice time camping and visiting Quebec City and the rural countryside around the Bay Peninsula, which was quite beautiful. We also stopped at the Ontario Science Center. This was just a few years after the Apollo landings. They were still going on, in fact, and they had obtained one of the early capsules to display at the Ontario Science Center. And this is actually the region where the eclipse occurred. This is the Bay Peninsula. We actually, I'll go on to the bottom line on this one. It was very cloudy that day. And so we drove up and down the road here trying to find, somewhat successfully, a hole in the clouds where we could actually see it. Didn't have time to set up our cameras very well, but we did get to see a good part of the eclipse. In terms of planning, this wasn't an optimal location because if you looked at the data, which of course is much more readily available now than it was then, you'd find out that 2/3 of the time it's cloudy there. But of course, that's statistics. You know, that's climate, that's not weather. It turns out for that eclipse, the best option was either out at sea or at Prince Edward Island, but even there it was in the range of 50% clouds. And we had some friends from Grand Rapids who went to PEI. We visited them later after the eclipse. And as I said, we had to chase clouds to see anything at all. But we had a great camping trip in Canada. It was very pleasant. We drove very leisurely. It wasn't like the trip to North Carolina where it was, you know what, for leather, where we just got in the car and drove nonstop like maniacs. Of course, we didn't have GPSs and computers back then, so you had to get yourself a magazine like Sky and Telescope, or go find a reference book and get out your highway map and draw the path of totality on it, and along with the duration of totality and where the band of complete totality was. So Canada was disappointing from a photographic perspective. This was the best photo I got. The visual view was a little bit better. But you know, the sun giveth and the sun taketh away. It was only 2 years after a sunspot maximum. And so a few months later in October, up in the Huron National Forest, near the Huron National Forest, we had a spectacular auroral display. So, you know, you get what you can and you enjoy what you get. Okay, the next one was the 1973 Atlantic cruise. The eclipse actually would have been 7 minutes in Mali, but even then Mali was kind of problematical. And now, of course, with Boko Haram and all the problems in that part of the world, the additional problems, not many people went to Mali. At the same time, there was a major drought occurring in the southern region of the Sahara called the Sahel, and it was blowing dust everywhere. The ship had planned to be right off the coast, but instead it stationed itself west of the Cape Verde Islands to get away from the dust. And in fact, the dust was recorded even over Brazil. It was that intense. And people who tried to observe from Mauritania, which is where the path made landfall, they had serious problems with sand. The ship had stabilizers, so it really wasn't too bad to do photography from. And of course, it was a wonderful cruise. Did not have a lot of ports, but it was fun. It was a fun cruise. It was especially nice because back in those days, you could actually get a cabin for 4 people with bunk beds, and your only personal amenity was a little section of a closet and a shared sink. Everything else was communal with the other people on your deck. But for people going to college, it was, the $450 price was very reasonable. And here's the Canberra, a lovely ship. She was originally commissioned in 1961, built from aluminum, which was quite a deal then, to make the trip from England to Australia. And of course, this was just about the time that jet travel was starting to come into its own. It was a slow start, of course, because of the problems that the Comet and the other early jets had, but the writing was on the wall. It was commissioned in 1960. By 1970s, it was being used for more coastal type cruises rather than long journeys from Liverpool to Sydney. In 1982, it was converted to a troop ship for the Falkland campaign, and then was returned to service a few years later, and then was finally scrapped in 1987. The White Star Line did not want to sell their premier ship and have it rebranded under another name, so it was towed to Pakistan and scrapped on the scrap yards there, which you've probably seen pictures of. It's one of the more dangerous industrial places. The scheduled time was like 6 months, and it took 2 years because the ship had such a deep draft that it had to be held way out in the water. It couldn't be brought right into the beach and scrapped there. Beautiful ship. And there's the view of the forecastle. Notice the length was 820 feet and the beam was 103, which would make it a very small ship by a lot of standards today. And here's the eclipse path. And we actually observed from out here. The further west you got, the eclipse would get shorter, but the air got clearer. So the captain had to make a call where he could reach. The day before, we were in Senegal, and we motored out that way. And there's Mali. This is where the eclipse was maximum. But nobody's complaining. It was an interesting cruise because there were so few ports, which I'll talk about later, that we actually had speakers, quite an extensive speaker bureau. Here on the left, far left of this photo is Dr. Vincent Schaefer from the Atmospheric Science Center at the State University of New York. Here is Scott Carpenter, a Mercury 7 astronaut and a crewman on the Sea Lab. Here is, if this was done today, this would be Neil deGrasse Tyson. This is the director of the Hayden Planetarium. Isaac Asimov, the science writer of the New York Times, and Neil Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong kept his room pretty much. I think one person bumped into him at a bar, and otherwise he and his family stayed in their stateroom, their penthouse. One of the best speakers from a personality standpoint, of course, as you might guess, would be Isaac Asimov. He was quite a character. You could actually approach him in the
Oh, Mark, you went unmuted. I mean, muted.
Okay.
Yes.
Am I back? Okay, thank you. How much did you guys miss?
You were starting to talk about running into Isaac Asimov somewhere.
Oh, okay, good. We didn't miss much then. Okay. And here's Mr. Armstrong, astronaut, first man on the moon, giving his talk. And of course, these two young men here with their cameras were totally representative of what we were all doing at the time. And he had some interesting remarks to make. And of course, he ended up being a professor of aeronautical engineering, of course, after he retired from NASA. As I mentioned, this cruise was somewhat sparse on ports. Started in New York, which of course gave me a chance to visit the city. I'd never been there. The Canary Islands, which of course was at the time still under Franco's regime, and Senegal, the city in Dakar, right at the tip of Cape Verde. And here's a picture of the Canberra taken at Tenerife in the Canary Islands. And here's landing and in Tenerife. And here's the market in Dakar. Of course, this was all film. So some of my film pictures have been destroyed by mold, whatever, over the years. And of course, being film, you didn't take that many pictures. It's quite striking when I go back and look at my archives from that time. And then we have eclipse days, and here's my traveling companions, Jerry Persha, who currently resides near Ruidoso, New Mexico, which is northeast of Alamogordo, near White Sands. He does exoplanet transits and spectroscopy up on top of the mountain in New Mexico. Here, he actually brought the largest equipment of any of us. This is my telescope that I brought on my tripod, the same tripod used in 1970, driven or manned by Gary Morin, who was the third member of our group, and then Gary Ross, who I traveled with to who I traveled with on the R-16 to the trip to the Bay Peninsula. This telescope was specially built for the eclipse. It had a 2-inch f/15, 30-inch focal length Jaeger's objective, and it had a bayonet mount at the back so I could put in a diagonal or put in my camera, which I swapped back and forth, which got a little hairy, frankly. I had a better solution for later. The two Garys were the most intelligent ones. They just had a simple telephoto lens and a tripod. They had the least equipment to mess with. But Jerry was not the biggest one there, not by a long shot. I don't know if people recognize this, but this is a much younger Dave Harrington, who brought his 16-inch to the eclipse. I'm still dumbfounded every time I see this picture. Just the shipping must have been, he had to build special crates and have it shipped to New York and then get it on the boat. It's quite an effort he made. Very, very laudable. Or it's a divine madness, depending on how you view it. So this is a false color image taken just before the start of totality. This is the so-called Bailey beads. You're seeing part of the chromosphere with bright spots coming through mountains on the moon. Again, this is film. Notice the little mold patch up here, which I deliberately didn't clean to show you what we're fighting. Those of us who have film pictures are still fighting with, if you live in humid climates. This is the inner corona. Notice the detail in the brushes. And then this is the middle corona taken. And again, notice it's somewhat splotchy because you're not at a maximum. You're 2 years off a max, 3 years off a maximum. So it's very segmented. It's not uniform. And then this is the final diamond ring, the second diamond ring. So again, it was near the time of solar minimum, so solar minimum activity. So you see that there's gaps, significant gaps and irregularities in the brushwork. And then this is sort of the impression it would give with a long exposure. So fortunately, I have a film scanner that still works. And now there was a 33-year pause. Other things interceded. I was involved with the Atlanta Astronomy Club, but that was when I was doing things in my career. And then I came back up north and moved to Chicagoland and got extremely busy with my career at Northrop. As I said, when I left the company, I had something like 16 weeks of vacation banked, which it was back in the good old days when companies would actually reimburse you for that. So Arlene and I sort of kept our eye on an eclipse we could do together. And we wanted to have a reasonable amount of travel involved. We didn't want to just, like in the 73 eclipse, get on a boat, spend days and days, which they made a good effort on the Canberra cruise with a lot of speakers. George Keane from Eastman Kodak and others, Vondel Chamberlain from Annular Planetarium. They were also speakers on that Canberra eclipse, the 1973 eclipse. This one, the star of the show wasn't so much the speakers, it was the ports. And the eclipse. So here's the ship we were on, the MSC Symphonia. It's actually bigger than the Canberra was. It was custom built, of course, for cruising. It was fairly new at the time. The itinerary was, of course, a large part of, in addition to the eclipse, the itinerary was wonderful. Started in Genoa, went to Naples and Pompeii, went through the Straits of Messina and stopped at Syracusa. Went on to Cairo, Alexandria, Giza. You go into Alexandria and you get in the bus and you go to the other place. And of course, there you're going to the pyramids. No time to go to Luxor. That's a little farther south. That would have blocked out like 4 or 5 more days to get down there. Then Tobruk, Libya for the eclipse. Then on to Tripoli and the Roman and Carthaginian ruins at Leptis Magna in Libya, which was one of the great surprises and delights on this cruise. And then to Valencia, Malta, and then on to Salerno and back to Genoa. So you can see it had a jam-packed itinerary, which of course you can do in the Mediterranean since it's fairly small. In addition to being a nice climate and having a lot of history, Mediterranean Sea is fairly compact, so you can have a lot of port days and see interesting things. Here's the itinerary drawn out. Where there would be confusion, I did it in blue dotted lines, so it has no other significance. And here's the eclipse path. It, of course, went much further down. This is just the close-up. The maximum totality was right near the border with Egypt, which is this line here. And we went into Brook and then, of course, took a bus that morning. The bus ride, the first part was cloudy and foggy, and everybody was biting their fingernails. But I'll tell you what happened later. Some of my friends actually, I believe from the Grand Rapids area actually, took another cruise that went up here off the coast of Turkey. Of course, Genoa is the birthplace of Christopher Colombo. We flew in 2 days early and spent a couple days there. It's a fascinating little town. Next stop was Naples. And of course, the reason you go to Naples is you can go to Naples to see Naples, but the real reason most people go there, of course, is to go to Pompeii, which we did, of course. And saw, I don't show them here, but well, I didn't show them here, but Pompeii not only had many ruins, but it had many wild dogs running around, or feral dogs. They're not unpleasant, but they were all over the place, mostly sleeping. And so now that we've put our nose to the millstone, we'll move on. Next stop was Syracusa. Syracuse is the bay is so shallow that even a purpose-built ship like the Symphonia, which had a shallow draft, much shallower than the Canberra, they still had to tender us in. Syracuse, of course, Syracuse is famous for having an extremely well-preserved Roman amphitheater, which in fact is used still for plays. You have to bring your own cushions, though. It's also the World War I Memorial of Italy is in Syracuse. A very beautiful building. And it's right across from a really good bakery, which of course we had to get cassata cake if you're in Sicily, which we did. Makes me want to go back to Sicily. We didn't go to Palermo. We didn't go to the southwestern coast, which is the where the temples of the gods are all located. Next stop was Egypt. And, you know, there is the obligatory things. You see the pyramids and the Sphinx. The Sphinx was being reconstructed, repaired at the time. And of course, the pyramids. This is one of the early step pyramids, of course, mud brick step pyramid. And no, we didn't ride the camel, but we did see many wonderful statues. Since we've been there, the Egyptian government have put in a new museum and moved many of the displays that were outdoors or were in storage and has moved them to this new museum located in Giza. This is in addition to the National Museum in Alexandria, in Cairo. So you can see Ramses II, I think. You can see Mr. Pharaoh Ramses many times. So from there we had a day at sea, and though the next stop was Tobruk. And here we are on landing at Tobruk. Actually, it's the eclipse day as we departed, but you can assume we're landing. The only disappointing thing about Libya is they were very strict about their observance of the prohibition against alcohol. And so everything had to be locked up. And from there, we took a bus ride. And while the first half was cloudy and misty, about an hour before we arrived at the observing site, it totally cleared. Totally cleared. And we were welcomed to Tobruk, both in Arabic and in English. We had our minders there. What's interesting is these were security people for the Libyan government. Not one of them had a gun that I could see. In contrast, in Egypt, our bus driver was accompanied by a young man in the jump seat who had an Uzi underneath his coat. This is because at that time, the Muslim Brotherhood was very active, so they were protecting tourists. The Libyans didn't have that concern. They were probably worried we'd wander off into the desert and get lost, which you could do. This desert was very interesting, by the way. In the springtime, it's very damp there. And so there's moss and snails everywhere. When this eclipse happened in July, you were stepping all over snail shells. And they provided this beautiful, very unique tent arrangement with beautiful carpets. But not all of us stayed in the carpets. We didn't, and neither did this gentleman. He's got a astrophysics, for those of you who know astronomy gear. He brought his astrophysics and his Takahashi rig with him. I have no idea how much insurance he got for it. In the background are two of my friends from the Fox Valley Club. And here's Arlene with my instrument, with the instrument that we used. It's an 80 millimeter f7 achromatic refractor. It's got a flip mirror on it. I'd learned my lesson on the Canberra with manually swapping eyepieces for cameras and going back and forth. And this one also was a shorter totality. So in this case, I had a flip mirror, which I could attach the camera to the back, focus the camera, and then slip focus the eyepiece, and then lock everything down to a fare-thee-well. And by simply turning a dial, I could alternately look through the telescope or let others look, like some of the Boy Scouts from Tobruk came out. We could look through the eyepiece and I could flip it down and take a picture. This is the same tripod you've seen in all the others, and you'd see it again in China if I had a picture of it there. I don't. This is a Tiltal Professional, first designed in 1948 and in continuous production till today. It was designed by the Marconi brothers, whose uncle was the inventor or the patentee of the ice cream cone. So it's a small world. His nephews got interested in photography. They couldn't find a suitable tripod, so they designed the Tiltal. And you can still buy this today on Amazon or at Beat H Photo Video. It's currently made in Taiwan. So what did Totality look like? Well, we had perfect weather. We had digital cameras at this point. At that time, it was a Pentax First DL, which was their first digital model. And so this is the first diamond ring, beautiful prominence. When we'd reached totality, I snapped a series starting at 1/16 of a second. This was all at ISO 400. 1/16 of a second going up to a good half a second. And then I, years later, used high dynamic range processing to merge all those photographs to get this picture, which allows you to see both some detail in the inner corona as well as seeing the outer corona. And again, this is a sunspot. This is near a sunspot minimum. So you're not seeing this uniform rays, you're seeing blotchy rays. And then this is a soup to nuts series of photographs taken. This was taken, of course, with a 99.99% rejection filter, so I didn't burn out my camera. And right after first contact, as it's called, where the moon first touches the sun, progressing all the way to second contact, which is the first diamond ring, totality pictures, and then the second diamond ring, and then the moon retreats. So it was a really, in my opinion, it was my best eclipse. The next best was the first, 1970. But we weren't done with Libya yet. We stopped in Tripoli, which is the capital, and went to Leptis Magnum, which was absolutely stunning. It didn't hurt that the weather was perfect again, which it was for the eclipse as well. But this is the Roman triumphal arch at Leptis Magnum. The theater. I mean, can you imagine sitting there watching a play and having the Mediterranean out there at your doorstep? And this was this is the Roman capital of the province of Croatia, which was North Africa to them. And so we went through Tripoli and departed. We had to stop at Greasy Square, which is where Mr. Gaddafi used to annually give a lecture, whatever, a diatribe, whatever you like. And so we got a chance to do a photo op with him. It was an interesting eclipse for a number of reasons. One of them was that that year in 2006, there were still a lot of restrictions on Libya. And in fact, when this eclipse was first booked, when the cruise was first opened up 6 months or so earlier, the only way you could get a visa to go to Libya was to send it to the Canadian consulary offices, because the US did not maintain any. And after a while, the Libyan government realized they were going to have so many visitors and it was going to be such a tourism opportunity for them that if people came in structured groups, they didn't have to get a visa. Our passports were all inspected by the Libyan authorities when we landed at Tobruk. And of course, the main thing they were looking for was to make sure that nobody had an Israeli stamp in it. It was kind of surprising to me because having been in the defense business, I was used to the idea of having, I didn't have to have one, but some of our people had to have two passports because one would have the Saudi stamps and the other one would have the Israeli stamps. But at very late in the game, the tour company woke up to this and warned people about that. So nobody had problems. Now, of course, unfortunately, it would be very difficult to go to Libya. It would not probably be safe for a while. I am happy to report, however, that Leptis Magna was never overrun by the maniacs. It was never damaged. So the people in Libya have had tough times. But from Tripoli, we went on to Valencia, Malta, which again, the Mediterranean continued to delight us with wonderful weather. Beautiful statuary, beautiful buildings. Again, it was a day stop, so we really couldn't do much other than walk around and enjoy this town. This is right at the port. Absolutely gorgeous. I mean, that's the way it looked. This ain't photoshopped or whatever. This ain't diddled with. This is the way it looked. It's burned into my memory. It was wonderful. And of course, you've got to see Maltese crosses. And of course, you have to see a Maltese falcon up on the top in the center, in the city square. So if you ever want to have a nice vacation, Sicily or Malta would be very high on my list if you like the sun and the Mediterranean skies. Okay, so next up was July 22, 2009 in Angie, China. Totality was over 5 minutes. We did this with a land tour with the Adler Planetarium staff. There was like 30 of us total, including 2 people from the Adler. We started in Beijing, of course, saw the Great Wall and the ancient observatory there. We had to go to Xi'an and see the Terracotta Warriors, of course. Hangzhou, which is known as the Garden City or the City of Lakes. In fact, it was so humid there, the inner crystal of my watch got fogged up. And I had to clean the sensor on my camera because even closed up, it was so humid that there was moisture on the sensor. Then we had the eclipse up near the Angie Reservoir, which is up on the top of the mountain, and then on to Shanghai. Some people had better, we had a decent eclipse, some had better, some had worse. Of course, you're in Beijing, you must go to the Forbidden City. And the Forbidden City is a whole series. If you ever look at it look at a map of it, it's actually a whole series of courtyards with buildings and halls, stage. So here's like the 3rd level into it. And then from there, we went to the Temple of the Sun, where the emperor used to read out the annual calendar after his astronomers had calculated it for him. Beijing itself, you can of course see the air pollution. It wasn't oppressive. It was not oppressive to breathe. We were lucky. Afterwards, it got worse that year, but that year the air in Beijing was not bad at all. Had many beautiful gardens in the city. Then we went to the Great Wall, and this is what can I say? It's the Great Wall. It's absolutely splendid. It's funny, just a few 30, 40 years ago, there were people in China saying they should take parts of the brick and build things with them. Now, of course, it's a major tourist destination, both internally and externally. Now that the Chinese people could before COVID travel a lot. They travel internally as well. So back in Beijing, this is a section of the old wall. And it's of interest because, of course, it's historic. It's part of the old wall that used to surround the city. But on top of it is the old observatory, which was first built around 750 AD. And the instruments are all of iron and bronze. Many of them will look familiar if you saw my talk on the Yantar Mantar in Jaipur, India, but where it was all stone work and much bigger. These are all made out of bronze and iron. And some of them look familiar. There's a quadrant, an emerald sphere. And I forget what this one is called, actually. There was a very similar instrument in India, except it had slabs all the way around. But it's basically a highfalutin sundial. Had a very nice display. I don't know if it's still there given the current climate between our cultures, but had a very nice mutual display there of European and Chinese astronomers, including the Portuguese Jesuits who first introduced modern astronomy into China. Again, I don't know if it's still there or not, but it was a very interesting display because it actually talked back and forth. It had many panels, and this is just one, and it talked back and forth about the interplay between the cultures. And then finally, at ground level, this sight ring for the equinox. Again, beautiful bronze work. Many of these artifacts were in fact stolen at the time of the Boxer Rebellion and taken to France and Germany. The Germans returned theirs first in the 1920s, and then shortly thereafter the French did. So these artifacts were carried all the way to Europe and then brought back, repatriated after the First World War. Okay, we're in Xi'an. This is the entrance hall to the display area with the world's largest terracotta wire. And this is the display hall. And this is the actual digs, the archaeological digs, which they built this gigantic structure over. And you get a sense of it, the scale of it from the size of the people. These have all been reconstructed from the fragments. You can see some of the fragments of other soldiers and chariots and horses behind them that have not yet been pieced together. And this is where the previous shot was taken, looking down into it. It's quite something, very impressive. I mean, the building is impressive as the devil. But the display, considering its antiquity, it gives you a measure of what a rich country China was and is. It's very large with many resources and people. Okay, now it's eclipse day. So we've left Hangzhou, which I'll show you a few pictures of in a moment, and we're driving up the mountain, which they restricted the access to special ticket holders. Our bus, of course, had a ticket for all of us. And so, not to be outdone by the Libya, the Chinese had Long Sing white tea welcomes friends from home and abroad to enjoy the once in a lifetime solar eclipse together. And things didn't look too good. It looked almost as bad as it was in the Gaspé. But things cleared out a little bit. This is the reservoir. It's actually a gravity battery, by which I mean during the night, excess electrical power from coal-fired electric plants, which you can't turn them on and off. There's huge thermal capacity in them. So they would take the excess energy being generated, the electricity being generated by those power plants during the night, because China doesn't have excess illumination like we do, at least not everywhere. And they would pump it up. They would pump water up into this reservoir. And then during the day, at times of peak demand, they'd let it run back down. And these are all folks from the Adler group. Right there, that's the last of these 4 or 5 people are Adler people. And so first contact came, and the clouds weren't too much of a problem. And then we got middle of the partial phase, and clouds were a little bit of a more problem. Then they went away again. It was pretty clear. And then the first diamond ring. Well, you get what you can get. You can see the clouds are much worse over here, actually. But you can actually see the diamond ring. And some non-astronomy people think this is more artistic than the others. So take your choice. And then during totality, it was a little bit clearer. Much better, again, than the Bay Peninsula was. And then the second diamond ring, it actually cleared up quite a bit. The clouds you can see were over here, so it cleared up quite a bit. And then the moon retreated and it was clear again. And so we drove down and got to the bottom of the mountain and it started pouring rain. And it turns out the people in Shanghai, which were on the eclipse path, they were totally rained out. I think Sky and Telescope had a group in there. People west of us, west of Angie, where we were, they had a little bit better weather if you went about 100 miles west. One family who were part of the original eclipse group with Adler actually got on a plane, rented a plane, and because grandpa was taking the grandkids and the children, his daughter and her son, husband, to this eclipse trip. He rented a plane and chartered it and went over into the desert and actually had a totally clear eclipse. But, you know, they didn't get to see Shanghai. Well, maybe they did, but they didn't see it when we did. This is the only stock photo in this show. This is the bottle opener building, the World Financial Center in Shanghai. The reason it's here is because if you see this gangway, it looks like a boxcar or a diner. That's actually a display area. So you take an ear popping, actually my ears popped at least twice, elevator ride up to the top of it, and you can look out. And so there's the radio tower. And there's the Chinese homage to the Chrysler building. Both of these are much, you can tell all these buildings are much shorter than the bottle opener, than the World Financial Center. Back in Hangzhou, we saw some beautiful gardens. This is where the inside of my watch crystal actually fogged up. It was so humid. I'll never complain about the humidity in the Midwest again. Well, I will, but I'll have some perspective at least. And so with that, we'll bid adieu. Another rainstorm came up, but fortunately the eclipse was over. And so we'll bid adieu to this Chinese scholar. So that was a great trip. It gave us a reason to see China, put some structure on it. The next one was much simpler. It was here in the US, what was called the first of two great American eclipses, April 21st, 2017 in Columbia, Missouri. We chose Columbia because it's a college town, and one of our club members had a family member who lived down there, and they had a location for us. So we went there. Some of my friends, I believe, from Grand Rapids in Ontario went down in here and had, I think, a perfect eclipse. Some of my other friends were near St. Joe, Kansas City, and they got drenched and hit a tornado. Other people in the west side of Lincoln, way past Lincoln, Nebraska, they had clear skies, as did other friends of mine in Wyoming. So you pays your money and you takes your choice. This had the virtue, it was a one-day drive. And it had an attraction for me. This is Christopher Wren Church in Fulton, Missouri. Why is it Christopher Wren Church in Fulton, Missouri? Because it's the home of the American Winston Churchill Museum and Archive. Of course, Fulton, Missouri is the home of Westminster College. And those of you who know history know why that's there. But we were lucky. We not only got to see a beautiful clear day, we not only got to see the outside of the building and the statues of Winston Churchill, but we also, by dumb luck, stumbled into a free lecture on Wren, Winston, and curiosity about the cosmos, which may seem like a very strange title. Well, the cosmos, of course, is because the next day was going to be an eclipse, and it was going to be almost, the path of totality didn't go through Fulton, but it came close. Christopher Wren, of course, because it's his church, he designed it, and because he actually improved the methods for predicting eclipses. Winston Churchill, why Winston Churchill? Well, we'll tell you in a moment. Beautiful organ was used, and they played an unusual concert. It was a whole series of organ music based around astronomical or similar astronomical themed music. Started out with Toccata and Fugue by Bach, which for an organ seems reasonable. Clair de Lune, the Jupiter suite from the planets, and then finishing with George Harrison's Here Comes the Sun. So it was a fun way to spend an hour. let's go back. Two questions. What's the Christopher Wren Church doing in Fulton, Missouri? Okay, Churchill Museum, that's fine. We'll tell you why if you don't remember. But why was Winston Churchill included in the talk, in an astronomy themed talk? Well, let's talk about the church first. It was built at 1200 AD as St. Mary the Virgin of Aldermanbury. At that time, it was a small town. It later, of course, became part of a parish and part of London, Greater London. It was destroyed by fire in 1666 in the Fire of London, along with the entire parish. The entire parish was leveled. And it had been the parish of Milton and Shakespeare, allegedly. It was rebuilt along with close to 36 other churches with designs by Christopher Wren. He was given the job of rebuilding large parts of the public buildings of London after the fire. And this church was one of them. But then it was destroyed in December 29, 1940 by the Luftwaffe in a bombing raid. So now the church's been destroyed twice. And so here's the connection. Why there's a Christopher Wren Church there. First of all, it was destroyed, which turned out to be handy. But the reason there's a Churchill Museum is because Westminster College, which is in Fulton, Missouri, which is where the church is now, delivered his Iron Curtain speech at the college. And of course, that's because of the connection with Harry Truman. But at this time in 46, St. Mary's was in ruins. I mean, a lot of London was still in tough shape. It was only a year after the war. This is what it looked like at the time. This is a stock photo from Getty Images. The entire roof was gone. The columns were there. Some of the glass remained, but most of it was gone. Well, what happened was, after he gave his speech, some of the local businessmen and Westminster alumni in Missouri thought, wouldn't it be grand to move this here? So they bought it. The Londoners thought they were mad. I mean, they were spending a couple $1 million or whatever it was at the time to move all these stones from London to Fulton. Well, they turned the first shovel in 1965. It took a while to get all this arranged, and the memorial was finally dedicated in 1969. So that's why there's a Christopher Wren Church. It was done as a centerpiece of the museum and the basement is the home of the Churchill Memorial and archive now. Okay. The archival papers weren't actually transferred till the 1980s, and the dedication of that involved the children. In the course of doing this, let me back up. In the course of doing this, the papers were transferred around 1980s, but they weren't all read all at once. And it was discovered around 2016, late 2016, it was found, and an article was published in Nature in February of 2017, that in fact, Winston Churchill in 1939 had drafted an article called, "Are We Alone in the Universe?" And basically he went through the logic, not the arithmetic, but the logic of the Drake equation. Saying, well, there's so many galaxies, we knew by then. There's so many galaxies, there's so many stars, there's, what's the odds of planets? We can't be alone in the universe. He came to that conclusion based on that. Well, it turns out one of his his granddaughter is named Edwina Sandys, and she's a sculptor. So they arranged to get pieces of the Berlin Wall and moved them. They moved to a church. Why not a couple of pieces of the Berlin Wall? So they moved a number of pieces of the Berlin Wall that had graffiti on them and installed them as a sculpture. Subsequently, it was visited by the great grandson of Winston Churchill, Duncan John Winston Sandys, who was the youngest Lord Mayor of London at the age of 24, elected in 2010. And he actually came and gave one of the speeches. Then in 2017, every year the memorial invests a number of scholars. And both Edwina Sands and Duncan John Winston Sands were both invested as Churchill scholars. For those of you who don't recognize the name Sandys, Sandys was in charge of Project Crossbow, the attempt to discern and plan the countermeasures for the V1s. He was the son-in-law of Winston Churchill, but he was well established in the ministries before that. So here we are at Little Dixie Lake the next day, and it's not perfectly clear, but it's not bad. And we're set up. I used the advantage for this, since I didn't have to get on an airplane for this cruise, to take a somewhat bigger telescope. And in fact, there's two cameras here. There's a DSLR here looking into the diagonal, so I don't have to grovel underneath the telescope. And then on the back of the telescope is a smaller camera with a smaller lens. And so we had first contact. Again, some haze, but not as bad as in China by a long shot. The reason I had gotten multiple pictures of the outer parts of the corona. The reason I wanted a bigger telescope, that was 1 meter long, almost double the other ones, was so I could actually get the prominences in the coronasphere, which I did. So there were some significant prominences up there, even though it was near a sunspot minimum. Then the smaller camera took this wide field view of the whole corona. So that was a successful eclipse. It wasn't as clear as Libya or North Carolina, but it was more successful than Angie, China. But we didn't go to, it was a different trip. We stayed overnight in Columbia. They have some nice restaurants there. It's a college university town. So we stayed overnight and then drove back through Hannibal, Missouri. It turns out we were smart to stay overnight because some of my friends from the Chicago area drove back the same day, and they spent hours and hours and hours in traffic. It wasn't quite as bad as what happened to the people that went down to Southern Illinois University, which had a big NASA-sponsored thing in the football stadium. They were totally clouded out during totality, and it took 8 hours to get out of the parking lot. So we were lucky. Arlene and I, we were smart or lucky, whichever you like, and we spent the night there and drove back at our leisure through pretty countryside. And so we stopped in Hannibal, Missouri to see the Mark Twain Museum, which I heartily recommend any of you who go in that part of the woods, please go. It also avoids the mess around St. Louis. You can actually go paint Tom Sawyer's wall, and you can see the entrance to Mark Twain's childhood home, but not where he was born. That was in Florida, Missouri. Notice the southern connection, by the way. Little Dixie Lake is where we did the observing from. His home was Florida. And in fact, the brief time he was involved in the Civil War, he was very, very briefly with a Confederate militia, which he got out of pretty quick. He realized it was the wrong thing to do. So this is actually the memorial in Florida, Missouri. And inside it, they actually have the house he was born in, was put into there. And the side, Florida, Missouri is gone, by the way. There's a couple of plaques there. But it was a nice little side trip. Oh, yes, and if you like, they also here have one of the largest Norman Rockwell collections, if you like to see Norman Rockwell pictures. Okay, so we've had some successful eclipses, but the ones I really remember are the ones where there was interesting travels involved. So, for example, the Africa eclipse in 1973, that was good. It was a good eclipse. I enjoyed it. But from a standpoint of tourism, it wasn't as rich as was the 2006 Mediterranean cruise. So looking forward into the future, what opportunities do you have for eclipses and travel? Well, 2023 in April, you're off the west coast of Africa and going up to Papua New Guinea. Totality's 1 minute, not very long eclipse. And the totality duration is in large part determined by how close the Earth is to the moon. The further away the moon is from the Earth, the shorter the totality, if it's total at all. It may be annular if it's too far. 2024, there's the part 2 of the American eclipses. It goes from central Mexico to New England and Canada's maritime provinces. And that's about 4 minutes, 28 seconds near Durango, Mexico. 30% cloud cover. It's not far from Mazatlan, by the way. In fact, Mazatlan's in the path of totality. So you can go to Mazatlan, go to the beach, and then go to see the eclipse. The odds aren't quite as good there weather-wise, but they're still pretty good. Unfortunately, it gets worse as you go northeast up the eclipse track. Near Fredericksburg, Texas, it's 50%. It drops off. It gets worse and worse as you go up to like it's 67% cloud cover when it gets near Indianapolis. This is the eclipse that will cross over in southern Illinois, the path of the one in 2017. 2026 is an interesting opportunity. It's a retrograde eclipse. It goes backwards. It starts at the North Pole and swings around, makes an arc, and then comes back out of the northwest into Spain. And the totality is under 2 minutes. And the best locale for this, although it'll be near sunset, is in northwest Spain, where the odds are in the range of 20% cloud cover. So here's the track of these 3 eclipses. Here's the one in next year in April, goes right through the tip of Australia. You know, if for some reason you want to see Western Australia, or if you want to go into Sydney and take a driving trip across the outback and visit the opal mines and whatever else they have to offer, then you can end up over there, or go along the coast from Melbourne. This is the one that's probably of most interest to people because it's a driving trip for us here. At sunrise, the eclipse starts out in the ocean, sweeps through Mexico, goes up through the center of the country, and then notice how it becomes elongated as it nears sunset. And there's the actual eclipse path shown statically. And again, your best odds from a weather standpoint are here. It gets worse and worse as you go up. But of course, that's 2 years away. So a lot can happen in the weather. Climate is different than weather. This is the really strange one. It starts up in the north of Russia, swings around, comes through Greenland, passes right by Iceland. It's not quite total in Reykjavik, but nearly. And then it swings down through the Atlantic Ocean and swings into the north coast of Spain. Unfortunately, all this region has 60% or worse cloud cover chances. And getting there is going to take some work. It's not something you can just jump in the car and drive. So it's hard to change your plans dynamically, unless you have a private plane, of course. The best odds from my perspective of seeing the eclipse are this stretch through Spain. It has the attraction that even if the eclipse is a bust, you can see Spain, which is always fun to do. I've never been to this part of Spain. I've been down to some of the ports down here. It'll actually go through Mallorca, which is like 50% chance cloud cover. The best odds are down here, south east of Soria, the town of Soria, where it's barely 20% cloud cover. But again, that's statistics. It's not weather. And it's right near sunset. Sunset is at 9:06 and totality ends at 8:31. So that means the sun will be about 7.5 degrees above the horizon at that time. So you got to pick a good site. If it's clear, you just got to make sure you have a good western horizon. If it was me, I would not do this with a group tour. I would book a private tour, which will actually cost you less because you're paying fewer people's salaries. And you can go into Madrid and have a private driver every day to take you around. And on eclipse day, you just motor up to there and see the eclipse in the afternoon. So that would be my bet if I was going. I mean, that's 4 years away. Who knows where we'll all be in 4 years. And of course, it's August, which is, of course, all of Europe's on vacation. So it might be kind of busy there. But still, there's a lot of real estate there to pack to get into. So let's not forget lunar eclipses. Very quickly go through these. They happen much more often because the Earth's shadow is so much bigger. And November 19th, for example, was nearly total. This was taken with the same lens. This was taken with a digital camera, but with the same lens that I used for the 1970 eclipse in North Carolina. It's been dismantled and cleaned by me at least once since then. And this is a composite. It's a little bit better than what the naked eye would show, but that eclipse was interesting because it wasn't quite total. So there was a bright limb on the moon, but you could see the Pleiades with the naked eye. So, and I could see it from my backyard. So that's one of the nice things about lunar eclipses. They cover large portions of the Earth. They don't just cover a little thin stripe. So you don't have to do as much traveling usually. This one was January 2000. This is actually film taken with the same lens and then scanned in. This was total. 2014, this was digital. And then that was, by the way, this was April of 2014. This was October of 2014. It's not unusual to have quadruplets in eclipses of the moon. In the same year, you can have two, and over a period of 2 years, you can have four. They may not all be visible from the same location, but that does happen sometimes. And this was an example of a doublet. This is the partial phases. This is a high dynamic range image. So you can actually see where you're in the umbra or the complete shadow of the Earth. This is the Earth's atmosphere shining through. And here it's just partially eclipsed. This is not the fully illuminated moon. Later in that eclipse, when the moon moved a little bit, when it was total, Uranus was in the same field of view, which is kind of an unusual picture. So that's the planet Uranus, and it just happened to be near the totally eclipsed moon. And again, depending on how deep the moon is in the shadow of the Earth, you may have a brighter patch on it, but that's still total. And then this was September of 2015, very dark eclipse. You can actually see, 7th magnitude stars are in this image with the moon right near them. Again, you're not quite in the center of the shadow, so the darkening isn't totally uniform, but it was a dark eclipse by normal standards. 2019, 2019 was another eclipse where it just so happened near a star cluster. Those of you who saw this eclipse from the north part of the country, it was like minus 20 degrees that night. Fortunately, we observed it from a park near our locations where we have a warming hut, so we could actually, not suffer horribly. And this was during the darkest phase, and this is the Beehive star cluster. It's actually a composite image, of course, because even with the moon totally eclipsed, it still would wash out all these objects. But the star cluster and the moon were clearly visible in a pair of binoculars. It was quite striking. And this is a wide field view of the same with high dynamic range processing. And there's a scale named for a Frenchman whose name I forget for how blue eclipses are. This blue cast, which is a measure of what the particulates in the Earth's atmosphere. And there's two this year. Both are visible from North America, both from Detroit and Chicago, one in May, one in November. The lunar eclipse in May, this is the total this is the complete shadow of the Earth, the so-called umbra. So this is the total, here you're totally in the Earth's shadow. So this eclipse will be fairly uniform in its darkness because it's pretty well in the entirety of the umbra. And this is a map that actually shows visibility, and the little arrow here is for Detroit. And this is the timing of it. Of course, you can go look this up when the time gets closer. Totality is almost an hour and a half. It's a total of 5 hours. Fortunately, hopefully May won't rain and it won't be too cold. And totality, the maximum eclipse, which this earlier diagram showed, is at midnight. So this is a midnight eclipse. The moon will be almost overhead. So if it's clear, the visibility should be quite good. The November eclipse is, notice it, the other one was a little bit below the center of the shadow. This one's a little bit above the center of the shadow. And this is a morning eclipse for us. Notice how this, with a lunar eclipse, you get this huge band in which you can see the eclipse. And for this one, the sun will rise about 20 minutes after the end of the eclipse. So you'll be able to see the total eclipse about 10, 15 degrees, if I remember right, above the horizon. But it's a morning eclipse. So you can get you can sleep half the night and then go see the eclipse. And that's the end. I'll take any questions. And for those who, this will be in the, in the recording, I hope. These are some references. Many of the graphics showing the eclipse path came from datentime.com. There's a website operated by Fred Aspenak, who for many years has been the standard source, called MrEclipse.com. There's an interesting book on the 1878 eclipse giving historical perspective on it, published just this last 2017, the year of our great eclipse. In the central US. And then the Canberra cruise, the pedrasfamily.com has a website where there's lots of information about how they arranged that eclipse cruise and also about the eclipse and the cruise itself. And with that.
Well, thank you, Mark. Megan, do you have questions?
I don't. No one's posted any questions on this. I think they've just been enjoying the views.
Yes, people have been enjoying it based on the comments.
Okay.
All right.
Well, again, the main thing for me is I have friends who go to every eclipse they possibly can. And that's fine. I mean, if that's what they want to do, that's fine. What I really enjoy were the eclipses where we had other things to do, whether it was camping, whether it was seeing historic places in the Mediterranean, whether it was visiting China, or going to Fulton, Missouri, which is in the wine country, by the way, in Missouri, which they got a lot of wineries there. So that, and it was easy to get to. So I enjoy the travel aspect along with the eclipse. It also means if the weather's bad for the eclipse, you at least have the touring. So.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the 2024 eclipse because it will be in northern Ohio, it will be visible, but we have a huge risk of cloud cover there. But I feel like we're close enough, everyone should wing it, and hopefully we'll have a shot at it. But I like your idea of going to Mexico.
Well, the thing we have now, even better than in 2017, excuse me, again, we should all be here, in 2017, is that the weather forecasts 4 days out are getting better and better. I mean, I noticed this as an astronomer because it's more and more easy for me to predict when I can and can't get out under the night sky. So the weather prediction is getting better and better as we go along. And there's many, many websites that you can get information on. So, if 3 days before the eclipse, it says it's going to be cloudy there, but not down in northern Texas, get in the car. We got an interstate system.
Schedule your vacation days now, but
yeah, give yourself some buffer.
Not a hotel room.
Yeah, well, you can always sleep in the car. That's what we did sometimes. That's what we did in 1970. We took turns driving, and one of us drove, and the other two slept.
Nice. Well, that was a big car too. You had some.
Yeah, they were called. That was Gary Ross's land yacht.
Somebody asked if you have recommendations for the best places in Michigan to see the 2 eclipses coming up this year for the lunar eclipses.
No, I mean, I would base that just on weather. The one caveat is in November, you need a place with a clear western horizon, a reasonably clear western horizon, because it's a morning eclipse. So you need to make sure you find a place that's got a decent western horizon for that one. But otherwise, anywhere in Michigan, it all comes down to weather. I mean, where I am is 30, 40 miles from O'Hare, and I'll see the O'Hare forecast, and it's totally different from my forecast.
Joseph's wondering if the light pollution around Detroit's going to be too much of a problem right in the city.
Not seriously. I mean, if you've got a street light blasting right on you, but I mean, lunar eclipses are fairly bright, even totality. But it wouldn't. If you can get down, if you can see a few stars, you ought to be okay.
I would say too, just so folks know, we have a couple of different dark sky designated areas in Michigan. There's the International Dark Sky Park up north, but there's also several county and state parks that have different forms of dark sky designations. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking for a place where you can see some nice stars around it too, Google dark sky designated parks and see what you come up with. But just for general viewing.
Yeah. Well, it also would pay, I didn't do it for this, but it would pay to get a planetarium program up and running and put the time of the eclipse in and see if there's any targets of opportunity near the moon, like those 2 I showed there, where we had very prominent star clusters right near the moon. And so I took pictures with a telephoto lens, and I also took pictures with a fairly wide angle lens, and then processed them and merged them using layers. You know,
That's a good idea. And there's several programs like that, like Stellarium has a free web app that you can use where you can put in the date and your location and start to see what materials or what stars are going to be around at different times. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, I found those programs are very useful for planning observing sessions. You know, with the November mostly total eclipse, not quite total eclipse we had in November this last year. I did exactly that and found a spot actually in my neighbor's driveway. I found a spot where I knew from the elevation and the azimuth with a protractor and a compass, nothing complicated. I knew that I'd be able to shoot the moon for the completeness of the eclipse, just by using a protractor to sight the elevation and the compass to do the azimuth. Because these programs like Stellarium or Cartousiel, they'll tell you the elevation and the azimuth of the object, so you can actually plan, you know, where it's going to be in the sky, not just go out there and be surprised.
That's a great idea.
The Warren Astronomical Society did a program out at Cranbrook with viewing the eclipse, and because there were a lot of people came to see it.
Yeah, that was like at 1 a.m., wasn't it?
It was very late and it was very cold.
Yeah. I was, like I said, all I had to do was pick up my gear and carry it out into the, plop it on my neighbor's driveway, and with their permission, of course, and then boom.
Somebody else asked Mark if you plan to get any of your old eclipse watching friends together with you for the North American eclipses that are coming up.
That's interesting, because it's quite funny, because actually when I moved to Chicago in 1984 and joined a couple of clubs a little bit afterwards, the first thing I did, I went to one club and stumbled into a guy who I had met on the Canberra. And he and I remembered each other, which was really strange. We hadn't seen each other since. And then 3 years later, I joined another club, because astronomy clubs are so cheap. It's cheap entertainment. You know, they all have different speakers. I joined another club about 20 miles away. And the first meeting I go to there's a guy from South Elgin, and he had been on the Canberra eclipse. So I don't know. Well, we'll see if I can get the old fearsome foursome again from the eclipse thing. Two of the guys who were on the Canberra eclipse, Gary and Ray, they went down. Ray was in near Hamilton, Ontario. Ray came into Detroit, and he and Gary went down to Tennessee, and they had a good time.
Nice. Somebody else suggested for the Michigan viewers, Point Pelee Park over in Ontario has a nice western view. So I suggested everyone make sure their passports are up to date now that we can get back into Canada. Check the rules about getting into Canada and testing and all that sort of stuff. But that's a great viewing spot.
Oh,
it would be.
So they have dropped their travel restrictions?
I have to check what it is right now. I know there are people going back and forth.
We are allowed to now, but the rules change frequently.
Yeah.
And I think they're still testing rules about getting tests before you.
Yes, you have to be tested.
Oh, like 72 hours or something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah.
We have another question about viewing morning eclipses.
Oh, the question is, would you want an eastern horizon for a morning eclipse?
No, the sun rises in the east, the moon sets. The moon sets in the west, and when it's full. Remember, this in a lunar eclipse, the moon is exactly opposite the sun. So if the sun's rising in the morning, that means the moon's setting in the west.
Because the Earth is the one blocking the light to the moon, making it look that way.
Right.
They say, of course, now, but it always helps to talk these things out, right?
Yeah,
it does.
That's where things like Stellarium or Cartousiel come in handy, because in case you have a brain, in case you have vapor lock of the brain, the program will set you right. Or ask a friend.
Well, these are all great, Mark. Thank you. And
Yes.
I want to go to Spain now. So
Yes, let's plan a trip to Spain.
Yeah, that to me, that's the best. The one in Australia is kind of like, but and the one in 2024 is going to be so easy to get to. We'll just do it, and so that leaves the Spanish one. So there, if you want to see partial solar eclipses or annual eclipses, there are some of those, and you can find them at dateandtime.com. The way I find it useful to find eclipses at that website actually is to Google one word, date and time, and then give the date, or even just eclipse 2023 or something, and hit return, and it'll take you directly to the page that has all the eclipses. Otherwise, you have to navigate their menus to get there. So
somebody posted a question about our telescopes over at Wayne State and if we ever open them up for use, the ones that are on top of the physics building. We don't tend to use the top of the physics building anymore, even honestly for the astronomy classes, just because the astronomy classes tend to be during the periods of high cloud cover. And so it's been really hard for them to schedule lab sessions to get the students up there. So that, and the other challenge we've been encountering sometimes is the air conditioning system causes some vibration issues from time to time. So the current astronomy faculty have found it difficult to use the space on the roof. But we have pulled out the telescopes for special viewing events more often on the sidewalk. It also makes it easier to get people to them because the roof is not accessible. You have to take stairs to get up there. And so that's not ideal. So we have on occasion done things out on the sidewalk. We don't have anything planned at the moment, although we've been talking about trying to do some things out at Belle Isle actually, but that is still in the works. Belle Isle is interested in trying to promote dark skies. And so one of the things we're looking at is trying to do some collaborative work. So stay tuned for some possible viewing opportunities with us, but nothing definitive yet.
Well, at the library, once we have in-person events again, I hope to have some more sidewalk telescope events.
Yeah. The other thing that we like to try to do is use the solar telescopes during the day, but because we've been in this solar minimum for a while, it's been pretty disappointing to try to use them. So we haven't tried those in a while. Hopefully we're getting more activity again. So that will be fun to do. We have lots of solar telescopes we like to bring out.
We will certainly try to tell people when we have more programs. Certainly I post things on Eventbrite. You can also, I should put my email address in here. I do try to keep a list to send our events to, but one of the nice things about Eventbrite is that you can follow me, and not that I'm trying to get followers, but it is a way to know, oh, another astronomy event.
And we tend to post our events for the planetarium on events.wayne.edu, which is the university's events calendar. So I know it's another calendar. They like to use their internal system. So keep an eye on those or on the planetarium website. It's possible we're going to pull something together in time for statewide astronomy night, which is on April, hold that thought, April 8th this year. It's a Friday night. So we're talking to the folks out at Belle Isle about trying to do some observing that night, but it's not confirmed yet. So if we're not doing something though, there will probably be other events happening. So for folks in Michigan, definitely look up statewide astronomy nights. Give it a few more weeks. They're still trying to finalize a list of all the events that will be happening around the state, but I'm guessing there will be more this year than we've had in the last 2 years.
And we will try to do something for Observe the Moon Night, which is in October, although because they scheduled it on a Saturday, that doesn't work as well for us because the library closes earlier on Saturday. And it takes a while to get over the top of the building, so that to have the moon go over the top of the building. But we will have that sometime in October. Yes, Tim Turner, who is our tech guy, suggested being able to simulcast.
That sounds awesome. Go
It
tech
does.
people, because that's
Yes.
beyond my
Oh, yes, I wouldn't
my
know where to start.
ability.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a great program. It's so much fun to see the pictures of the eclipses and the pictures of everything you saw while you were exploring the eclipses.
Yes, this was a great presentation.
Well, thank you. It was
Yes.
a pleasure. And I hope people have I hope we all have good weather for the lunar eclipses, and all of us are able to make some kind of plans for the solar eclipses, which fortunately are far enough away that
They're far enough away.
this will all be a memory, I hope.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And I did post the YouTube channel, but it should be, I would allow a week. We should have it there, and I should stop recording at this point.
Thank you, as always, Jennifer, for organizing your monthly events too. This was great.
Thank you very much.